What they found in Dan Fogelberg's estate will leave you speechless. He was the voice of a generation, then a ghost in his own time. Dan Fogelberg, the soft-spoken troubadour of the 1970s, left behind a legacy of tender ballads, platinum records, and a name slowly eclipsed by the passage of time. But when the locks on his estate were finally turned and the storage vaults unearthed, what they found was not just music. It was a paper trail of betrayal, hidden recordings, destroyed evidence, and a mystery too deep to ignore. Why was his final album kept hidden? And who wanted his truth buried with him? Dan Fogelberg wasn't built for fame. He didn't chase it. He didn't need the roar of crowds or the rush of sold-out tours. He had something quieter, something more enduring. Born in Peoria, Illinois, in 1951, Dan was the son of a high school band director and a mother who taught him the value of introspection. Where other kids idolized rock stars, Dan immersed himself in classical piano and painting. He studied theater. He wrote poetry. He never saw himself on the cover of Rolling Stone, and yet, somehow, he got there. In the early 70s, after a meandering journey westward, Dan found his way into the heart of Laurel Canyon, just as it was blooming into the center of the singer-songwriter renaissance. He was younger than the Dylans and Mitchells, but he carried the same ache. His music, soft, poetic, unguarded, spoke to something deeper than rebellion. It spoke to longing, to loss, to love that didn't last. But even at the height of his success, with platinum albums like Souvenirs, Phoenix, and The Innocent Age, Dan was drifting away from the industry, from the press, from the public eye. He called Los Angeles a mirage of ego and eventually disappeared into the Colorado Rockies, settling in a secluded mountain retreat he named Owl Creek. There, among pine trees and snowfall, he built a studio, and he began recording music no one was meant to hear. By the time he was diagnosed with advanced prostate cancer in 2004, Dan had almost vanished entirely from public life. No children, few interviews. He left behind only his widow, Jean, and a network of properties scattered across Colorado and Maine. When he died in 2007, fans mourned, but assumed his legacy was tidy, complete. Then came the estate inventory, a legal formality, a list of assets to satisfy taxes and resolve ownership. But what they found inside the Owl Creek vault was not just music. It was a map of secrets, and the beginning of a very different story. By the time Dan Fogelberg passed away in 2007, his name had become a whisper in the national consciousness. He was no longer played on major radio stations. His albums, once staples in every suburban record cabinet, had slipped into thrift stores and dusty attics. Younger listeners barely recognized his songs. The man who once topped the charts with Longer and leader of the band had become an artifact of a lost era. But his disappearance from the spotlight wasn't entirely due to changing tastes or shifting pop trends. Fogelberg had helped orchestrate it. Disillusioned by the industry's obsession with branding and chart placement, he withdrew more and more with each passing year. He refused to license songs to commercials, declined tour opportunities, rejected multiple offers to remaster his catalog under corporate oversight. One former publicist described him as a man trying to disappear from a machine he once helped feed. Privately, Fogelberg had grown increasingly paranoid about how his work would be remembered or misused. He transferred the master recordings of several early albums from record label storage to Owl Creek, defying legal warnings from Epic Records. The tapes were housed in a fireproof, temperature-controlled vault beneath his Colorado home. It was a place few people knew existed. When those tapes were finally cataloged posthumously, archivists uncovered far more than expected. Dozens of unlabeled reels, folders marked "For Dan Only," cassette tapes with songs that appeared on no known albums, and handwritten notes filled with crossed-out lines and cryptic phrases like "Too Raw," "Never Release," and "She'll know what this means." The mystery grew deeper when the estate's legal team discovered irregularities in Fogelberg's contract history. Several documents had been deliberately left unsigned. Others contained redactions. A quiet legal inquiry began. What was Fogelberg hiding from the industry that made him? And more pressingly, what or who had he been trying to keep out of the archives? Buried in a forgotten drawer in the back of the Owl Creek vault, archivists found a weathered shoebox. Its contents would reshape everything they thought they knew about Dan Fogelberg. Inside were letters, dozens of them, each addressed to a single woman. Some were typed, others scrawled in a hurried hand. The dates ranged from 1974 to 1986, overlapping with the most prolific and celebrated period of Dan's career. The tone of the early letters was romantic, lyrical, lines that echoed the gentle yearning of his music. But as the years progressed, the messages became strained, fearful, regretful. "If this ever gets out," he wrote in one, "they'll take everything from me." The woman's name was carefully redacted from all publicly released documents. Even now, it remains legally sealed. But insiders within the estate confirm she was an early lover, someone never publicly acknowledged. She was not a groupie, not a passing fling. She was something else, someone significant, and she had not remained silent. Next to the shoebox was a manila envelope containing legal correspondence, letters exchanged between Dan and a now-deceased entertainment lawyer. The tone? Urgent, panicked. The subject? Ownership of unreleased songs, and a threat. The woman, it seemed, had once demanded recognition for a song that later appeared on one of Dan's most successful albums. There were also references to a pregnancy, a payoff, and what one document chillingly called reputational containment. The archivists, stunned, passed the findings to the estate lawyers. The response was swift and unequivocal. Seal it, suppress it, and notify Jean. Publicly, nothing changed. But behind the scenes, Dan Fogelberg's legacy was suddenly radioactive. Because this wasn't just a lost love, it was potentially a lost heir. And buried within the music he left behind might have been the proof. To walk into Dan Fogelberg's studio at Owl Creek was to step into a time capsule. The main space looked as if he had just stepped out for a walk in the woods. Dust hadn't settled on the analog consoles. His vintage Martin D41 still leaned gently against a worn leather stool. Even the harmonium used during the Innocent Age sessions sat in wait, its keys yellowed but untouched. The air smelled faintly of cedar and aged tape, sacred, preserved. But hidden behind the rustic warmth tucked at the back of the structure and masked by a wall stacked with decorative firewood was something no one had prepared for. A false wall, and behind it, a door. Small, steel-reinforced, and locked from the inside. Once opened, investigators discovered a second studio. Windowless, fully soundproofed. A control panel built into the wall, but no computer. No digital interface. Just analog equipment. Reels, cassettes, tube amps, all wired into a private recording booth that no one in Dan's orbit had ever mentioned. There was no record of its construction in building permits. No photographs. It was invisible. Until now. Inside, the real Dan Fogelberg began to speak. Labeled only by dates, the tapes contained recordings that veered dramatically from his public persona. Songs brimming not with love and nature, but dread, fury, betrayal. One track, simply titled December 5th, 1983, opened with a whispered monologue about contracts that kill careers and promises never signed, only implied. In a worn spiral notebook labeled Private, Not for Review, were lyrics soaked in paranoia. They came with ink and sugar smiles, but I signed with blood and silence. And then the tape, the one that now sits in legal purgatory, guarded under threat of injunction. The Kill contract. No official record of such a project exists. No label, no collaborators, no reference in any biography. But the tape was real, and Dan recorded it for someone, or against someone. The question was no longer whether Dan had secrets. It was whether he ever intended for them to survive him. After Dan Fogelberg's death in December 2007, the public saw only grace. Obituaries celebrated his introspective genius. Jean Fogelberg, his wife of 6 years, issued a soft-spoken statement thanking fans for their love. She appeared briefly at a tribute concert in Nashville, and then receded into quiet remembrance. But behind the veil of grief was a storm. Jean, who had inherited the bulk of Dan's estate, was thrust into a maze of paperwork, competing interests, and buried tensions. Friends said she aged rapidly that year, haunted not just by loss, but by the weight of what Dan left behind. The Owl Creek Vault was more than an archive. It was a Pandora's box. Within months, legacy recordings came knocking. They wanted access. They offered a 7-figure deal. Jean declined. Then they came again, this time with double the offer. Again, she refused. Her answer was final. That's when the lawsuits began. A distant cousin, unheard from in decades, filed suit claiming Dan had once promised him shared royalties from future releases. A former producer claimed partial ownership of the Owl Creek masters. Both were funded by third-party entities tied to a publishing syndicate Dan had feuded with in the 1980s, the same group he once accused, in a private letter, of repackaging pain as product. To protect herself, Jean reluctantly granted a temporary inventory contract to an external archivist, a respected figure in the music preservation world. He arrived with gloves, a scanner, and a promise to respect the materials. He left with 3 archival boxes. Only 2 were ever returned. Jean never spoke of what went missing, but from that day forward, she refused to greenlight any release of the unreleased works, despite mounting public pressure. Not out of nostalgia, not even out of loyalty, out of fear. Because some songs were never written for ears, they were warnings. By 2015, the rumors had evolved into legend. Somewhere in the Owl Creek archives, it was said, lay Dan Fogelberg's final masterpiece, a collection of songs written after his cancer diagnosis. His reckoning, one insider called it, not a goodbye, but a confession, full of rage, tenderness, and unresolved shame. No official album ever emerged, but whispers reached the halls of Sony Music. That's when Legacy Recordings made their move. Under the guise of honoring Dan's work, they announced a tribute album, a tribute to Dan Fogelberg, featuring well-known country and adult contemporary stars. Publicly, it was a nostalgic celebration. John Fogelberg appeared in the press circuit, smiling cautiously, even lending her blessing. Fans were thrilled. But buried in the contractual fine print was a clause. Legacy had acquired limited rights to select unreleased recordings from the Owl Creek inventory. Not full albums, not full control, just fragments. When the album debuted in 2017, one track stood out immediately. Souvenirs, alt take, sparse, haunting, intimate. It was unlike any previously released version, but something felt off. Longtime collaborators, including one of Dan's former engineers, went public with their confusion. "That wasn't an alt take," he said flatly. "That was part of a suite Dan wrote before he knew he was dying. He called it My Last Truth. We demoed it in 2003. It was never meant to be edited, never meant to be renamed. It had been stripped, sanitized, repackaged. The label framed it as reverent homage, but those who knew Dan's intentions saw something else, a quiet coup. Legacy had begun releasing pieces of the hidden archive, out of context, without explanation, without consent. Dan's final words were leaking into the world, but not in the form he intended. His truth, once so carefully guarded, was being rewritten, one track at a time. The journals were never supposed to survive him. Bound in cracked leather, tied shut with sun-bleached twine, they sat at the bottom of a cedar trunk in the Owl Creek vault. Decades of Dan Fogelberg's private thoughts, painfully handwritten on yellowing pages, never indexed, never scanned. They weren't diaries, they were warnings. He wrote about fame as a slow theft of the soul, about people who smile while they steal, and about the emptiness of playing music to an audience that only wanted the old hits. In one undated entry, he described a recurring dream in which he played to a dark, empty theater, singing into silence. Other entries named no one, but spoke volumes. "They offered me the sky and handed me strings," one read. "I was never meant to be their product." And then, in the margins of a page written sometime in the early 2000s, a chilling line scratched in darker ink. "They'll burn what I leave behind, but I'll make sure they feel the smoke." Buried deeper in his digital backups, password protected and recovered only after forensic IT assistance, was a letter, addressed to Jean, dated 6 months before his death. It was clear, direct, and non-negotiable. "If anyone tries to release my private writings without consent, destroy them. Not just the songs, everything." Jean did exactly that. In the fall of 2010, neighbors reported the smell of burning paper coming from Owl Creek. Local authorities logged it as a controlled burn, nothing illegal. No questions were asked. But those close to the estate knew what was happening. The trunk, the journals, the pages smeared with water, or maybe tears, reduced to smoke and memory. Only a few scattered fragments remain, salvaged from old scans or saved in anonymous hands, but the bulk, thousands of pages, are gone, burned not out of spite, but protection. What truth was Dan trying to erase? And who was he afraid would twist it into something he never meant? In early 2020, Kevin Mercer stepped forward. A name mostly unknown outside of session logs and engineer credits, Mercer had once been a rising figure in analog mixing before quietly leaving the industry in 2005. His revelation was quiet, almost whispered, shared during a podcast interview about lost recordings. But what he said sent shockwaves through the tight-knit Fogelberg circles. He claimed that in 2003, just months before Dan's cancer diagnosis, they had worked together in a private studio to record a full-length album. It was called The Wild Divide. According to Mercer, this wasn't a casual side project or a series of demos. It was a fully conceptualized album. 9 tracks, sequenced, emotionally brutal. It wasn't Dan the balladeer, he said. It was Dan the truth-teller, the wounded prophet. There were moments on that tape where he could barely finish a verse. One song, titled Bloodwood, reportedly left Dan shaken after the first playback. Mercer described it as the rawest thing he ever wrote. Nothing about nature, nothing about romance, just legacy and regret. The tracks were recorded entirely to analog tape, Dan's demand. He didn't trust digital. He took the reels with him when the sessions ended, and they were never seen again. When Dan died in 2007, Mercer reached out to the estate. He asked about the tapes. He offered to help mix and master. The response: silence. Later, rejection. The tapes were not listed in the official estate inventory. Archivists found no record of the Wild Divide among the boxes retrieved from Owl Creek. Some believe the tapes were misfiled. Others think they were destroyed, possibly during the burn that erased Dan's journals. But one theory lingers, that the Wild Divide was never meant to be found, that it was Dan's requiem, written for no audience but himself, a final truth too raw to be heard, and too powerful to be shared. Joan Fogelberg never asked for this. She married Dan late in his life, during a time of stillness, not stardom. He was no longer touring, no longer chasing charts. He was writing, painting, healing, and slowly fading. After his death, she became his voice. She managed his website, curated his photography, answered fan letters with handwritten notes. But beneath that serenity was a storm she never invited. It started quietly, a label asking for access to the vault. Then another. Then friends of Dan she hadn't spoken to in years, calling with suggestions, demands, threats. Release the tapes. Honor his legacy. You owe it to the fans. Some called her selfish. Others called her a coward. By 2016, the pressure turned invasive. Former collaborators began to question her stewardship publicly. Private letters were leaked. One ex-bandmate accused her of burying Dan twice. Another claimed she was hiding tapes to cash in later. Jean never responded, but in 2018, she posted something unusual, a blog entry. It was short, reflective, painful. In it, she wrote, Dan was both deeply known and never fully understood. There are promises made in private that cannot be broken in public. Within days, the post vanished. Rumors began to swirl of a memoir Jean had written and shelved, a manuscript said to contain details about Dan's final months, the missing album, and the true contents of the Owl Creek vault. But like the Wild Divide, it never surfaced. Some blame her for the silence. Others believe she honored the one promise Dan never revoked, to let the truth stay buried. But one thing is certain, she bore the weight of his secrets, protected them, carried them through lawsuits, threats, and a music industry desperate to repackage what Dan had spent a lifetime trying to escape. Dan Fogelberg was laid to rest near Deer Isle, Maine. There was no televised funeral, no public ceremony, just wind, stone, and sea. His grave is quiet, modest, engraved only with his name, his dates, and a treble clef. It is fitting for a man who once said he didn't want tributes or monuments, just a return to silence. But in that silence, something persists. Every few years, a whisper emerges, a rumor, a sliver of melody, a bootleg recording passed between collectors, a cassette tape labeled The Wild Divide appearing on an auction site, only to vanish within hours. A lyric fragment traced back to a notebook no one admits to owning. Then, just as quickly, it's gone, pulled, retracted. denied, as if the truth itself had been programmed to disappear. What remains is a legacy frozen in amber. Official releases, sanitized tributes, posthumous compilations curated for mass comfort. But beneath the surface, buried in studio walls and burned pages, lives a far more complicated man. He was not just the poet of lost love and golden autumns. He was a man betrayed, a man who wrote songs no one was allowed to hear, a man who spent his final years not seeking adoration, but control of his story, of his sound, of his silence. He was buried once by cancer, and then again by the erasure he orchestrated himself. What they found in Dan Fogelberg's estate wasn't just music. It was a coded confession, half burned and half buried, a final truth wrapped in silence. So, what was Dan really trying to say? Maybe it's time we finally listen. Subscribe for more buried truths and tell us, should The Wild Divide be released?